They told her the town had a debt, that every year something in the woods demanded a sacrifice. But the townspeople don't choose the offering, it chooses. It seeks the outsider, the one who doubts, the one who doesn't belong. What happens when your refusal to believe is the very thing that marks you as the next victim? When your rational mind doesn't protect you, but instead paints a target on your back? In a place like Havenwood, the facts won't save you. The sterile, blue-white glow of monitors was the only thing that felt real in the newsroom after 10 p.m. It was the native light of Eliza Vance's world, a clean, logical glare that cut through the day's messy sentimentality. Dressed in a practical, dark blazer that was more armor than clothing, Eli stared at her screen, her face a study in tired cynicism. With a series of sharp, decisive clicks, she redlined the prose of the article before her, titled, "Local Hero Rescues Cat from Tree." She gutted it, deleting adjectives like heartwarming and plucky with surgical precision. Her editor, David, a man whose permanent expression was one of being 3 deadlines behind, hovered by her desk. He held a tablet like a peace offering. "Eli, I've got something. Might be up your alley. Hiker went missing on the Appalachian Trail 2 days ago." Eli didn't even look up. "No, he didn't, David." "What do you mean?" "Family reported him missing. Cars at the trailhead." "I mean," she said, finally turning her cool, analytical gaze on him, "he isn't a mystery. He's a statistic. 94% probability he's suffering from exposure. 4% probability of a disabling injury from a fall. 2% probability of a negative encounter with fauna, most likely a black bear. The story writes itself, and it's a tragedy, not a conspiracy." She turned back to her screen. "It's an obituary waiting for a body. Find me a real story, a lie to expose, a system that's broken." Her workspace was a fortress of logic amidst the newsroom's creative chaos. Pens were aligned in perfect parallels. Notepads were squared off. It was the command center of a mind that desperately needed the world to make sense, to operate on predictable principles, even if those principles were grim. She needed patterns, not one-off misfortunes. She hunted for the rot in the foundations, not the cracks in the paint. Later, in the minimalist quiet of her grey-toned apartment, Eli scrolled through the day's digital refuse. Her home was an extension of her desk. Clean lines, no clutter, nothing personal that wasn't also functional. It was a space designed for thinking, not for living. As she was about to close her laptop, an email from an encrypted, untraceable address caught her eye. The subject line was just 2 words. "Look closer at Havenwood." Curiosity, that old, persistent itch, made her click. The message was brutally brief, a series of data points stripped of all emotion. They don't just go missing, they're taken. One every year. Founders Festival. Leo Keane, 10/28/2024. Sarah Pike, 10/28/2023. James Farrow, 10/28/2022. Hannah Cole, 10/28/2021. Markham Cho, 10/28/2020. Eli sat upright. The cynical slouch in her posture vanished, replaced by the electric focus of a predator that has caught a scent. This was different. The same date. Every single year. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, opening a new, encrypted file on her private server. She plugged the names into the National Missing Persons database. One by one they appeared. Each a verified active case. Each filed within a week of October 28th. Each from the same small rural county encompassing the town of Havenwood. Her heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't a series of unfortunate events. This wasn't random tragedy. This was a schedule. It was a system. And it was broken. The drive into Havenwood felt like passing through a membrane into another time. One moment, she was on a standard, sun-bleached stretch of state highway. The next, she passed a weathered wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Havenwood, a good place to settle." The slogan felt less like a friendly greeting and more like a warning. The town itself was unnervingly picturesque. Lawns were manicured to an obsessive degree. Quaint storefronts were adorned with primitive smiling suns and stylized cornhusk dolls that hung from every lamppost. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. There were no children playing, no neighbors chatting over fences. The streets were almost completely empty, yet she felt 1,000 eyes on her. As her sensible sedan crept down Main Street, she saw the curtains in picture-perfect windows twitch. The gazes that followed her progress weren't curious. They were guarded, suspicious. The entire idyllic facade felt manufactured, a stage set where the actors knew a stranger had just stumbled into their performance. Her rational mind logged the data: quaint town, folk art, low population density. But her instincts, the ones she always tried to suppress, screamed that something was fundamentally wrong. The sheriff's office was a small, cluttered space that smelled of stale coffee and old paper. Fishing lures were tangled in a pile on a filing cabinet, and dusty photos of grim-faced town founders stared down from the walls. Sheriff Brody sat behind a desk that seemed to be losing a war with paperwork. He was a man in his 50s, with a soft paunch and the weary, sharp eyes of someone who had seen too much and decided to stop looking. He looked up as Eli entered, his face instantly setting into a neutral, unreadable mask. "Can I help you?" "Eliza Vance," she said, holding out her press credentials. "I'm a reporter. I'm doing a piece on missing persons in rural communities. I was hoping to ask you about Leo Keene." Brody's demeanor, already guarded, turned instantly defensive. He waved a dismissive hand, not even glancing at her ID. Leo Keene? Kid got tired of small-town life, that's all. Packed a bag and took off for the big city. Happens all the time. His car was found abandoned at the edge of the woods, Eli countered, her tone even. And according to public records, he's one of 5 people to go missing from this town in the last 5 years, all in the last week of October. The sheriff leaned back, the springs of his old chair groaning in protest. He looked at her, and for a moment, the weary mask slipped, revealing a flash of something cold and hard underneath. "This is a quiet town, Ms. Vance. People look out for each other. We handle our own problems." He stood up, a clear signal that the conversation was over. His voice dropped, losing its folksy drawl and taking on the flat edge of a threat. "I suggest you move on. There's no story for you here." Sheriff Brody's warning had been a dismissal, a door slammed shut. But for a journalist like Eli Vance, a slammed door was just an invitation to find the window. If the town's official guardian of the law was part of the cover-up, then she needed to find a voice outside the system, someone whose loss was too raw to be silenced by small-town pressure. That voice belonged to Martha Keene. The Keene house was a museum of a life interrupted. School photos and sports trophies lined the mantelpiece, gathering a thin layer of dust. The air was thick with the scent of stale air and grief. Martha Keene, a woman who seemed to have been hollowed out from the inside, sat opposite Eli in a cluttered living room, clutching a damp, shredded tissue. Eli began gently, her questions forensic but delivered with a practiced empathy. She was trying to establish a timeline, a map of Leo Keene's last known hours. "When did you last see him, Martha? Did he say anything unusual? Was he meeting anyone?" Martha's answers were vague, lost in a fog of sorrow. But when Eli mentioned the Founders Festival, a switch was flipped. A sharp, undeniable fear flashed in Martha's eyes, cutting through the haze. "No," she whispered, leaning forward so intensely that the coffee table between them felt like a chasm. It wasn't the festival, it was the reaping. Eli kept her expression neutral, a mask of compassionate interest. "The town..." Martha's voice dropped even lower, becoming a conspiratorial rasp. "It has a debt, an old one. Every year it has to be paid. It took my boy, just like it took the others." Eli nodded slowly, her mind working on a separate track. In her mental notebook, she was already writing the caption for this encounter. Subject projecting grief onto local superstition. A shared folklore provides a narrative framework for random, inexplicable loss, a common psychological coping mechanism in isolated communities. She saw a tragic, broken woman, not a witness, She saw a symptom of the town's sickness, not a diagnosis. Leaving the suffocating grief of the Keene house behind, Eli sought refuge in her natural habitat, an archive. The Havenwood Public Library was a dusty, silent tomb where facts went to be forgotten. Behind a heavy desk, a librarian who looked as ancient as the card catalogue pointed her towards the microfilm room without a word. For hours, Eli's world shrank to the sickly green glow of the reader's screen. She scrolled through decades of the Havenwood Valley Chronicle, her eyes scanning for keywords: missing, accident, festival. And she found it. Not at first, but slowly, the pattern emerged from the grainy black and white print. A constellation of tragedy hidden in plain sight. October 30th, 1987. Local man lost in hunting accident. October 29th, 1992. Teenage girl presumed runaway after festival. October 30th, 1999. Unfortunate disappearance, Mars founders celebration. On and on it went, a horrifyingly consistent timeline of loss, always coinciding with the festival, always couched in the language of random misfortune. With each discovery, her conviction grew. This wasn't the work of some ancient, debt-collecting entity. This was the work of a predator, or a group of them, hiding their monstrous tradition behind the flimsy curtain of a small-town festival. She meticulously photographed each article with her phone, the methodical clicks echoing in the silence. The data was clear. The hypothesis was simple. This was a human conspiracy. All she needed now was the physical evidence. That search took her to the edge of the Whispering Pines forest, to the spot where Leo Keene's car had been found. The faded police tape, fluttering from low branches, felt like a joke. A cursory glance, a shrug, and a case closed. Eli walked the scene with a forensic eye, her gaze sweeping the ground for what the sheriff had so conveniently missed. She looked for scuff marks in the dirt, for the disturbed earth that would indicate a struggle. She scanned the undergrowth for snagged threads of clothing, for drops of blood, for the shallow, hastily dug grave. She found nothing, absolutely nothing. No footprints other than the deputies, no broken branches, no signs of a body being dragged. The scene was sterile, clean, as if a person had simply been standing there one moment and had been plucked from existence the next. This didn't fit. Her theory, her neat and tidy serial killer hypothesis, demanded a physical confrontation. It demanded a messy human violence. This profound lack of evidence was a contradiction, an anomalous data point that her logical mind couldn't file away. For the first time, a seed of doubt, cold and unwelcome, was planted in the fertile ground of her certainty. Frustrated, she pushed deeper into the woods, away from the sterile crime scene. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet, and casting long skeletal shadows that seemed to claw at the forest floor. The air grew colder, clinging to her skin. Lost in thought, her foot caught on an exposed root, and she pitched forward, throwing out a hand to steady herself against the broad trunk of an ancient oak. Her palm slapped against the rough bark, and she felt it. Something carved, not fresh, not the work of a teenager with a pocket knife. The edges were smooth, worn down by countless seasons, as if the symbol had grown with the tree itself. She pulled her hand back, as if burned, and stared. It was an intricate, spiraling design, unlike anything she had ever seen. As the last rays of sunlight pierced the canopy, the symbol seemed to absorb the light, pulsing with a faint, dark energy. A jolt of pure, primal fear shot through her, an emotion so alien to her rational mind that she couldn't immediately process it. It was not the fear of a human threat, but the ancient, superstitious dread of the dark, the unknown. Her hand trembled as she raised her phone and snapped a photo, the click of the shutter sounding impossibly loud in the sudden heavy silence of the woods. The symbol was real, tangible, and it didn't belong to the world she knew. Back in the sterile anonymity of her motel room, Eli stared at the photo on her phone. The symbol seemed to stare back, a dark eye in the heart of an ancient tree. It was a tangible object, a piece of evidence, yet it felt like it belonged to a different category of reality than she was used to. Trying to wrestle it back into the realm of the rational, she uploaded the image to her laptop. She attached it to an email addressed to Dr. Alastair Finch, her former folklore professor, a man with an encyclopedic knowledge of human belief systems. She forced a dismissive tone into her writing, a familiar shield against the inexplicable. "Alastair," she typed, "probably some local LARPers getting carried away, but have you seen anything like this before?" With the message sent, she tried to focus, to get back to the facts. She opened the draft of her article, titled Havenwood, a Tradition of Death. She wrote about a town paralyzed by fear, about a predator or a cult that had operated with impunity for decades, hiding their crimes behind local superstition. She described the pattern, the dates, the victims. It was a solid piece of investigative journalism, logical and evidence-based. It was the only story that made sense. An email notification chimed, making her jump. It was from Alastair. His reply had been almost instantaneous. Her blood ran cold as she read his stark, hurried words. "Eli, where did you find this? This isn't folklore. It has no cognates in any known human tradition. It bears a structural resemblance to pre-Bronze Age petroglyphs, hypothesized to be for placation of non-terrestrial entities. Stay away from it." "I'm not joking." A voice of scientific authority, her trusted expert, had not provided a rational explanation. He had offered a warning that bordered on pure, superstitious fear. The neat lines of her investigation began to blur. The next morning, armed with a new and unsettling urgency, Eli walked back into the sheriff's office. She didn't bother with pleasantries. She slapped the printed photos of the old newspaper articles onto his desk, fanning them out like a poker hand. "This isn't Runaways, Brody," she said, her voice tight. "It's a tradition, a schedule, and you've been letting it happen." The sheriff's weary demeanor evaporated, replaced by a cold fury she hadn't seen before. With a single violent motion, he swept the photos from his desk, sending them scattering across the floor. He leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk, his voice a low, threatening snarl. "You have no idea what you're messing with," he said. "Some things are required to keep the balance, to keep this town safe, to keep it prosperous." He straightened up, his eyes filled with a fanatic's certainty. "You need to leave Havenwood, now, for your own good." It was a confession. He wasn't protecting a killer. He was protecting the ritual itself. Eli stood there, frozen, realizing she was utterly alone. The institution of law and order, the bedrock of the rational world she relied on, was an active participant in the town's madness. That night, she returned to her motel, her mind reeling. She saw it as soon as she was halfway across the parking lot. The door to her room was slightly ajar, her heart hammered against her ribs. She pushed the door open slowly. The room had been tossed. Her laptop was open, her carefully organized notes scattered across the cheap bedspread. But her wallet was on the nightstand. Her camera was still on the table. This wasn't a robbery. Then she saw it. Placed precisely in the center of her pillow was a small, human-shaped effigy. It was crudely fashioned from tied twigs and what looked sickeningly like dark, human hair. It was a primitive, terrifying warning. The investigation was no longer about a historical pattern. The ritual, whatever it was aware of her. And it had just made her its next subject. The fear was no longer intellectual. It was a physical presence in the room, a cold hand gripping her heart. The next day, the threat hanging over her like a shroud. Eli found her courage in a well of cold anger. She walked into the town square, where preparations for the Founders' Festival were underway. A man stood on the central gazebo, directing the proceedings with a calm, charismatic authority. He was handsome, in his 60s, with a preacher's easy confidence. Eli knew instinctively this was the man she needed to see. This was Malachi Thorne. She walked straight up to him, her voice recorder in her hand. "Mr. Thorne," she began, cutting through the pleasantries of the locals around him. I spoke to Martha Keene. She mentioned a debt, a reaping. Malachi Thorne turned to her, and he smiled. It was a brilliant, charming smile that did not reach his cold, assessing eyes. "Ah, the reporter," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. He wasn't surprised or defensive. He was expecting her. "Belief is a tool, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Like a hammer. It can build a house, or it can crush a skull. The power isn't in the hammer, it's in the hand that wields it. Our town has simply chosen how to wield its belief. We maintain a delicate balance." He wasn't confessing to a crime. He was espousing a philosophy. He spoke of superstition, not as a delusion, but as a fundamental force of the universe, one that could be managed and directed. His calm, rational justification for the unthinkable was more chilling than any crazed rant could ever be. As night fell, the Founders' Festival began. The town square was lit by the flickering, primitive light of torches, casting dancing shadows on the faces of the townspeople. They were dressed in strange, rustic folk costumes, their faces painted with forced smiles. The atmosphere was thick with a grim, performative merriment, a party thrown for an unseen and demanding audience. Eli moved through the throng, a ghost at the feast. Her camera felt heavy in her hand, her recorder a useless talisman of logic in a world that had abandoned it. She saw Martha Keene in the crowd, her face a pale mask of sheer terror. She saw Sheriff Brody, no longer in uniform, his eyes scanning the crowd like a hawk searching for its prey. A procession began to form, led by Malachi. The time was coming. Her journalistic drive, the core of her being, warred with every instinct for self-preservation. She could run. She could get in her car and drive until Havenwood was nothing but a bad dream. But she knew she couldn't. She had to know. She had to see what lay waiting in the darkness of the woods. She gripped her camera tighter, and with a final resolute breath, she committed herself to seeing the night through to its bitter end. The public-facing part of the Founders' Festival died with a final, guttering gasp. The forced smiles melted away, the music ceased, and the crowd began to disperse into the chilly night, eager to get back behind their locked doors. But a select few remained. From the steps of the gazebo, Malachi Thorne descended, holding a single, antique lantern that cast a pool of warm, unsteady light. Without a word, a solemn procession formed behind him. Eli recognized their faces from the town square, the stern-faced baker, the quiet librarian, and walking with a grim purpose that chilled her to the bone, Sheriff Brody. Their path did not lead back to their homes. It led away from the streetlights, away from the flimsy pretense of civilization, and toward the dark, gaping maw of the Whispering Pines forest. This was it. The secret ceremony. The true festival. Eli slipped away from the dwindling crowd, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction, but the journalist, the truth seeker, was in control now. She was fully committed to this path of unscientific behavior, skulking, spying, hiding in the shadows. The rational approach of direct questioning had failed, and now she was forced to adopt the methods of a conspirator. Her camera felt both impossibly heavy and reassuringly solid in her hands. She kept to the shadows, moving from the cover of a building to the trunk of a tree, following the bobbing lantern light into the darkness. Deeper in the forest, the world transformed. The air grew unnaturally still and frigid, her breath pluming in front of her face in silvery clouds. The only light was from Malachi's lantern, which threw their shadows against the trees, twisting them into monstrous dancing shapes that capered just at the edge of her vision. The procession moved with a slow, deliberate, ritualistic pace. It wasn't a walk. It was a dirge. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic crunch of their footsteps on damp leaves and something else. A low, almost subsonic hum. It started so faintly, she thought it was her own blood roaring in her ears, but it grew steadily, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate in her teeth and bones. It was a physical phenomenon, a measurable frequency, yet it had no discernible source. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. The scientific part of her brain scrambled for an explanation: underground water, a distant power line. But her primal senses, the ones she always distrusted, told her a different story. This sound was ancient. It was wrong. It was the sound of the forest breathing. She continued her silent pursuit, moving from tree to tree, the hum growing louder, more oppressive, until the procession finally came to a halt. They had arrived in a large circular clearing. In its center stood the gnarled ancient oak where she had first found the symbol. But now she saw the full horror of the place. Dozens of similar symbols marked the trunks of the trees that ringed the clearing, and they were all glowing. A faint, sickly golden light pulsed from the carvings, casting the entire clearing in an ethereal, diseased twilight. The townspeople stood motionless, their faces blank and empty, as if in a trance. Malachi raised his lantern and in a low voice began to chant. The words were guttural, alien, a language that had no business being spoken by a human tongue. Hidden behind a massive, moss-covered fallen log, Eli's hands shook, but her mind was clear. This was the story. This was the proof. She raised her camera, centering Malachi in the frame, the glowing symbols of the clearing arrayed behind him. She needed this one shot. The camera flash fired with the explosive crack of a gunshot. She hadn't activated it. A surge of inexplicable energy, a technical malfunction she would never be able to explain. The chanting stopped. The hum ceased. In the ringing silence, every single head in the clearing snapped in her direction, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Malachi Thorne's eyes, gleaming in the lantern light, locked directly onto hers. He smiled, a slow, terrible smile of triumphant finality. "The offering has arrived," he said calmly. Panic, pure and absolute, seized her. She didn't think, she just ran. She scrambled over the log and crashed into the undergrowth, branches whipping at her face. The chase was on, but the sounds of pursuit behind her were wrong. It wasn't just the thud of human footsteps. It was a skittering, a cracking, a dry, rustling sound, as if the dead leaves themselves were rising up to chase her. Branches, thick as arms, seemed to reach for her, snagging her clothes, tripping her feet. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw nothing but the dark, empty woods. But the sounds were closer now, all around her. Her rational mind screamed that it was just the townspeople, their sounds distorted by panic and the forest acoustics. But her terror-stricken heart knew better. She was not being chased by people. She was being hunted by the woods itself. Running blindly through the oppressive darkness, with the unnatural sounds of pursuit closing in around her, Eli finally burst through a curtain of grasping branches and stumbled back into the place she had just fled, the ritual clearing. She was cornered. From the shadows between the glowing trees, the townspeople emerged, their faces impassive, their bodies forming a silent, human wall. They blocked all exits. At their head stood Malachi Thorne, his lantern casting a serene light, and beside him, Sheriff Brody, his face set like stone. Eli's lungs burned, her legs trembled with exhaustion. She pointed a shaking finger at Malachi, her voice a ragged pant. "It's you," she gasped. "You're a monster, a cult leader. You've been killing these people for years." It was her last desperate attempt to anchor herself to the world of reason, to frame the horror in the familiar terms of human evil. Malachi shook his head slowly, a look of profound pity in his eyes. "We don't kill anyone, Ms. Vance," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying across the entire clearing. "We never have. This land remembers," Malachi continued, his voice taking on a strange, echoing quality, as if the trees themselves were speaking through him. "And it demands a balance, a price for its prosperity. We don't choose the offering. It does." He gestured around the clearing at the silent woods. "It chooses those who don't belong, those who doubt, those who pry." His gaze settled on Eli, and in his eyes she saw the terrible, logical endpoint of her investigation. Your skepticism, your refusal to believe. It's like a dissonant sound in a perfect harmony. It draws attention. It marks you. He raised a hand and pointed it directly at her. You are a discordant note in the song of this valley. Your presence here, your questions, your disbelief. You have made yourself the offering. As he spoke the final word, the wind began to howl through the clearing, a mournful, hungry sound, yet not a single leaf on the motionless trees stirred. The low hum that had vibrated in her bones intensified, rising in pitch until it was a physical pressure against her eardrums. The sickly golden light from the symbols on the trees brightened, pulsing in time with the deafening sound. The entity manifested. It was not a beast of fang and claw. It was an assault on the very fabric of perception. The air before Eli began to shimmer and warp like a heat haze rising from asphalt. The deep shadows cast by the trees detached themselves from their sources, writhing on the ground like pools of living ink. The humming roar became a deafening cacophony, and woven within it, Eli could hear whispers, the faint, terrified voices of the victims she had researched, their names echoing in the vortex of sound. Leo, Sarah, James. The townspeople, as one, fell to their knees, their heads bowed in supplication. In the center of the clearing, a patch of absolute darkness began to coalesce, a hole in reality that absorbed all light, all sound. It was formless, a void given presence, and it began to drift slowly, silently, towards Eli. Her mind, the rational, analytical tool she had honed her entire life, was screaming. It had no framework for this, no category, no explanation. This was an event that was completely unfalsifiable, a phenomenon that violated every known law of physics. This was not a lie to be exposed. This was a truth that could not be told. Terror pure and absolute threatened to consume her. But as the presence closed in, a different instinct took over. Not fight, not flight. The core, unshakable instinct of who she was. A reporter. Her trembling fingers fumbled in her pocket, closing around the cool, hard plastic of her digital voice recorder. She pulled it out, holding it before her like a crucifix. She didn't scream. She didn't pray. She reported. It's 11:47 p.m., she said, her voice shaking but clear and steady, cutting through the din. She pressed the record button. The small red light blinked on, a tiny beacon of empirical fact in a world of terrifying belief. I am in a clearing in Havenwood with the residents of the town. She began listing facts, the cold, hard data that had led her here. Leo Keane, age 19, vanished last year on October 28th. Sarah Pike, age 28, vanished the year before, same date. She recited the names from the anonymous email, the data from the archives, her voice growing stronger, more confident with each documented truth. With each spoken fact, the formless darkness before her seemed to flicker, its edges losing their cohesion. The deafening hum wavered, a discordant note introduced into its perfect, horrifying frequency. Her assertion of objective, documented reality was anathema to a being powered by subjective belief and fear. She was fighting their superstition, not with a competing belief, but with the cold, hard weapon of science. The data. Markham Cho, she declared, her voice ringing with certainty. Vanished 5 years ago. This is a pattern. This is a fact. The presence recoiled. A terrible, silent scream, echoing not in the air, but in her mind. It convulsed, imploded, and with a final, agonized shriek that tore through the clearing, it dissipated into nothingness, leaving only a sudden, profound silence and the scent of ozone. The first rays of dawn were breaking as Eli's car sped down the highway, leaving Havenwood and its whispering pines in the rearview mirror. Her face was pale, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. She was changed. The cynical armor she had worn for so long was gone, shattered, replaced by something else. She glanced at the passenger seat, at the small digital voice recorder. The little red light was still blinking. A faithful, silent witness. It contained the story of a lifetime. It contained a truth that no one would ever believe. Her expression was no longer just cynical. It was haunted, forever imbued with the weight of a terrible knowledge that science could not classify and superstition could not fully explain. The story of Eliza Vance in Havenwood does something fascinating with the classic science versus superstition conflict. It's not a simple case of one being right and the other being wrong. Instead, it treats both as functioning systems of logic. The town's belief isn't just a delusion, it's a transactional relationship with a force that seems to operate on its own terrifying rules. But the most compelling part is how the conflict is resolved. Eli doesn't win by suddenly adopting their faith or finding a bigger, better magical solution. She wins by weaponizing her own belief system, empiricism. In the final confrontation, her voice recorder becomes her talisman, and the recitation of names, dates, and patterns, the cold, hard data, becomes a form of scientific incantation. It suggests that a system built on fear and ambiguity is uniquely vulnerable to objective, documented reality. The story frames her journalism not just as a search for truth, but as a genuine act of power, a shield against the irrational. Her facts don't just describe the world, they actively defend it. It leaves us with a really interesting question. Where does the power of a story like this really lie? In the terrifying belief that drives the town, or in the stubborn facts that ultimately save the day?